So, thank you very much. First of all, to Herbert and to Hans for, sorry for not replying to your email for about 3 months, but it all worked out. And also to all the organisers of this European Social Week. You know, Hayek, the economic philosopher, used to say that if you put the word social in front of something, it not only...
The introductory remarks and presentations of yesterday have made us already conscious of the fact that international conferences, such as European weeks, are not islands. They happen in a historical context, and any serious conversation on social issues today must take that context and its transformation into account. This is not denying that more than ever we need inspiring ideas. Certainly in this year 2016, in which we celebrate the 500th anniversary of the Utopia written by Thomas More. In this regard, yesterday's presentations by Lord Glassman and Hein Donner were really inspiring. Without the force of ideas, we will not be able to find meaningful perspectives for the future. Without a new sense of direction, as Lord Glassman said, we risk to become reduced to mere commodities. But as we have also heard yesterday, ideas are necessary but not sufficient. We need to explain how they work. What we need, first of all, in order to make them work, is a clear awareness of reality. A radical evolution can only take place if it starts from an adequate understanding of what is. That is the reason why Pope Francis stated in Evangelii Gaudium that realities are more important than ideas, and ideas not rooted in reality lead to alienating ideologies. And precisely in this regard, we have a problem. The European society today is so drastically changed since the previous social week in Ostend that we are now in a situation of urgency, which I can summarize with the words of a notorious Belgian Freemason, Luc van der Kelen, in Tertio. I quote, "Europe has reached a turning point, civilization shakes." And nothing much is left anymore from the all too reassuring and glossy discourse of Herman van Rompuy during the previous social week. And if I may remind the fact that George Soros even predicted recently the breakup of Europe if the Union would be incapable of resolving its crisis. And I will first try to describe some events that changed the European social scene, and I will do that not by enumerating simply a series of separated events, but I will see them as a cluster of interrelated issues which constitute a crisis in which the future of the Union is at stake. First of all, as we have already heard yesterday, since the previous social week we are confronted with a migration and refugee crisis unseen since the end of the Second World War. On the one hand, there is the continuing stream of economic migrants from North and Sub-Saharan Africa, whose journey often ends tragically in the Mediterranean. Already more than 12,000 registered migrants were drowned in the sea. The Mediterranean Sea has become Europe's graveyard. Others end in the jungle of Calais with its inhumane life conditions. Anyone who understands the consequences of demographic evolutions in Africa and of climate change knows that this sort of migration will not stop. Simultaneously, there are more than 1 million refugees from the Middle East, victims of either the Syrian war or the cruelties committed by the Islamic State. Many have traveled and continue to travel via Turkey overseas to Greece, often facilitated by cynic human traffickers for whom the massive migration has become a several billion euros business. Europe's citizens have been quite indifferent to the tragedy of refugees from the Middle East till the picture of a drowned child shocked the moral conscience of the entire continent. A child that is only one of the more than 300 children drowned in the last 5 months. The massive exodus of refugees has become a source of disagreement between EU member states. Many countries refuse to accept a fair share in the distribution of the burdens of hospitality, an attitude invigorated by an imaginary fear of an Islamization of Europe or of a loss of the national or cultural identity. And yet, one should remain realistic. According to Peter Bouckaert, CEO of Human Rights Watch, even if the stream of refugees continues till the end of 2017 with the same speed as it has been the case until now, the group of refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan will be no bigger than 0.4% of the European population. Compare that with Lebanon, where 25% of the population is refugee. But despite this, the situation has become so problematic that a climate of anxiety has shaken the very foundations of solidarity among European countries in general, and even it has put the Schengen Agreement into jeopardy, even to such an extent that the former president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, declared loudly in Brussels, "Schengen is dead." This is one of the most disastrous, self-fulfilling prophecies ever heard in Europe. And I fear that so Margaret Thatcher's metaphor of Fortress Europe becomes reality. The problem is, however, that even in the most hospitable countries, the climate has changed. Merkel's courageous "Wir schaffen es" is put into question. Germany is not the same anymore after the massive sexual harassment of women on New Year's Eve in Cologne, and the controversy about who are responsible, refugees or pseudo-refugees from North Africa, has not ended yet. Police and justice contradict each other. The suspicion has grown everywhere, and even Scandinavian countries like Sweden are closing their borders. The refugee crisis reveals, moreover, willingly, unwillingly, a culture clash, at least in the perception of both the Europeans and the refugees. And this clash has become a religious conflict, which Gilles Kepel has predicted already years ago under the title "The Revenge of God," or in other words, the return of religion in the public square. The situation has paradoxical consequences. Even secularists are now pleading for the protection of our Christian culture. It has moreover created a new and general climate of intolerance. There are new radical anti-Islamic movements. There is an increasing climate of anti-Semitism, followed by a still limited but significant exodus of Jews to Israel. And there are also new forms of intolerance in circles of young fundamentalist Muslims, for example, in the form of insulting women and bashing homosexuals. The question, however, is whether the religious radicalization of many young Muslims is not a consequence of the fact that young people searching for meaning and for making sense of life find nowhere else to provide them with answers, nowhere else than in circles of radicalized religious leaders. Indeed, what is the alternative of a society which has lost its soul and purpose? The undeniable religious conflict is moreover intensified by two other phenomena which are not necessarily religious: terrorism and the return to radical nationalism. What terrorism is concerned, France, and particularly the French libertarian lifestyle, has become the main target. While the assassination of members of the editorial board of Charlie Hebdo could still receive some sympathy from people rejecting its blasphemous cartoons, the indiscriminate, massive killing of November has had an impact on the whole of society, and in many regards. It has not only intensified anti-Islamism, but it had also a positive result, namely a more articulated acceptance of the secular state by Muslim states and an interesting and fundamental conversation about the meaning of the secular state and the relationship between religion and state. But notwithstanding this positive evolution, there is also the undeniable reality that many leaders today, as a consequence of terrorism, they have become obsessed by security, so obsessed that they are ready to realize it at the expense of our fundamental values. In normal circumstances, security is one of the main tasks of the state, but today it has become the weapon of the proponents of an all-embracing surveillance state who put into jeopardy human and civil rights. And so they erode the very fundament of a democratic state of law. And don't forget that we heard again the words, particularly in France, we are at war. That brings me to the next point. While the fall of the Berlin Wall and communism made us dreaming of a lasting peace, Europe is again confronted with serious international conflicts, not only with ISIS, but also with Russia. The conflict in Ukraine, the killing by a Russian missile of innocent citizens in a Malaysian Airlines flight, the annexation of Crimea, and the subsequent economic measures at both sides have created tensions with Russia, unrest in the Baltic, and it has intensified Russian nationalism. In the meantime, the impact of the foreign policy of the EU remains marginal, and the lack of an integrated European defense policy is corn on the mill of Putin's divide et impera politics. It leads also to a parallel strong NATO policy, which in turn ignites the old Russian fear for being threatened. Let us remind that the USA have quadrupled their budget for defense in Europe because of the perceived threat by Russia. Hence the official Russian reaction: the Cold War is back. And yet, escalation must be avoided. not least because Russia is a partner in trying to find the solution of the Syrian conflict. If we don't resolve that, we can also not resolve the refugee crisis. Together with the intensification of conflicts to which European countries contribute by continuing to sell weapons directly or indirectly to almost all parties, we can also observe a revival of radical nationalism in general and radical nationalist parties in particular. In France, the program of the Front National is a combination of anti-Islamism and anti-EU thinking, justified by the argument that national sovereignty is in peril. Nationalistic conservatism is prevalent in Hungary and Poland, and in other regions, separatist movements shake the foundations of the states, such as in Scotland, Catalonia, and in some regards, even in my country, Flanders. The revival of nationalism, and even extreme nationalism, is so strong that it has even got a grip on the Catholic Church. To give only one example, the bishops' conferences of Poland and Hungary have threatened last week to give up their membership of Comité, that is the organization of bishops' conferences of the EU. They only want to remain members on the condition that the press agency of Comité, Europe Info, withdraws critical articles from their website, such as an article on the ideology of the new right. Such a mix of nationalism and religion is unseen since the nationalistic propaganda communities in France and Germany during the First World War. It sows the seeds of new forms of censorship and the creation of authoritarian states. Unfortunately, the proponents of nationalism forget why the EU was created, namely sustainable peace after disastrous world wars. And they forget President Mitterrand's historical address to the European Parliament. Le nationalisme, c'est la guerre. It is the return to chaos. And if all of this is not enough, there are also the negative tendencies combined with the risk of a new economic recession. In fact, we have never been fully recovered from the previous economic crisis, but recent developments do not allow us to be very optimistic. Problems in China and the fall of the price of raw oil have caused unrest on the stock markets and particularly reawakened the fear of a new bank crisis. The inequality gap diagnosed by Piketty is moreover confirmed by many studies, and despite some signs of improvement mentioned during the last social week, the economic crisis still affects Southern Europe. Greece, Italy, Spain are still confronted with huge youth unemployment. Simultaneously, the work pressure and uncertainty among employees, workers, and middle managers increases, as well as the experience of work as meaningless, which causes burnout and work-related depression. Jérôme Vignon's analysis during the last social week has lost nothing of its actual value. And in the margins of the economic crisis, one should also raise the question whether the radicalization of young Muslims is that simply a religious issue, when we consider that many of them live in ghettos in the suburbs with their own often violent subcultures, and where young Muslims, even with a university degree, do not get a fair access to the labor market. Frustration and humiliation are fertile ground for radicalism. All the issues I mentioned converge in an all-embracing problem. The EU weakened by national self-interest, by the myopic worldview of a bureaucracy alienated from real life, that EU seems to be incapable of finding adequate answers. EU leaders behave like the eternally hesitating Hamlet. They lack leadership at the moment that to be together or not to be together is the question. Or has the EU really become, as the New York Times describes it, a narrow-minded reality with 28 different shades? And let me just mention a few of these problems. We've already yesterday heard that the prospect of a UK withdrawal from the Union and the extent of sympathy with Britain's criticism of the Union in other member states. That weakens the Union. The European bureaucracy, which is still dominated, like many national bureaucracies, by the ideology of the new public management, instead of playing the role of civil service and public value policy. This bureaucracy lays much more emphasis on defending the interests of multinationals and agribusiness than on social Europe. Symptomatic for this is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Pact. The European Parliament is seriously influenced by corporate lobbyists. For example, I do not see how the weakened standards for toxic emissions by cars are a contribution to a healthy environment. And the Irish expert John Sweeney diagnoses that despite Jean-Claude Juncker's social dialogue, the enthusiasm for the project of social Europe has cooled. Because according to him, of three major developments, the economic recession and its hugely asymmetric aspects on member states, unresolved issues arising from the major enlargement of the Union and the implosion of societies on the Union's external borders, and then the refugee problem. Moreover, by keeping the interest rates low and pumping more money into the economy, the European Central Bank contributes to postponing the bill of the crisis of 2008 to the next generation. My analysis of the weakening of the EU and its incapacity to find sustainable solutions for the complex crisis is not meant to be a negative prophecy, although it sounds like this, but it is meant to be a warning. We have reached the moment of truth. My point is that we can't talk during this social week of things new and radical evolution and continue to speak as if everything is business as usual. We simply can't discuss our problems in the same way as we did in the past. Or to say it with Einstein, we can't resolve our problems with the thinking and acting that caused them. But moments of crisis are not necessarily negative turning points. They can also be, as the Greek root of the word suggests, a moment of reflection and judgment. The task ahead of us is thus to discern in the happenings and in the evolutions and longings of today, to discern there positive signs of the time, positive tendencies containing the seeds of the future. That is what Otto Scharmer articulates as learning from the future as it emerges. And this emergence we can observe if we are ready to see with new and fresh eyes beyond the narrow parameters of thinking caused by anxiety. Let me mention a few positive tendencies. First of all, as Zulehner predicted at the end of the previous social week, there is a growing consciousness that climate change intensifies our responsibility for the natural and human environment. Since the fifth social week, the consciousness of the link between social justice and climate change has become stronger. And two important facts can be mentioned here, positive facts. The relatively positive outcome of the climate conference in Paris and the warm reception of the encyclical Laudato Si among non-Catholics, sometimes more among non-Catholics than Catholics. Both are an indication of a change in the mentality. In this context, it is not a detail that Pope Francis in Laudato Si has articulated the clear link between ecological problems and poverty, the poor, and that are also the most vulnerable people among us, are the first and primordial victims of climate change, a change that in several regions of the world has also an impact on the increase of migration. A second point, from the positive point from the previous conference, that we must keep in mind is its attention for surprisingly new initiatives, fresh experiments in sharing business interests, new forms of local energy production, which together with other new developments shape a new communitarian type of economy and also a new era in the civil society. Against extreme rights movements, there is a positive counter-movement of reawakened solidarity. One can think here of the spontaneous generosity and bravery of many people who rescue and take care of people arriving from the sea and Greek islands, people who share houses and goods, people who welcome refugees at train stations, people who go to the jungle in Calais, where some have taken initiatives for the education of children. There were the collective mourning moments and rituals after the attacks in Paris. Such acts of solidarity and community building are signs that something positive is emerging in the civil society. In a Flemish discussion groups, we now use the expression civil society 2.0 or middle field 2.0. In the new expressions of solidarity, a new type of civil society is emerging in which traditional social movements are challenged by new movements. For example, simple example, Let's Go Urban, an urban movement for street dance and art which offers to youth from a migrant background opportunities to discover their talents. Another example are the new political movements at the grassroots, which break open the classical party politics, such as Podemos in Spain. All this is, as John Sweeney writes, a ray of hope and a wake-up call for social Europe. It is the expression of what Christine Heyer from Boston College has called subversive solidarity, a real counter-movement of people who build bridges to foster community. And this is a remedy against what Pope Francis has called the globalization of indifference. And it also leads to the rediscovery of the very meaning of politics, namely politics as to provide incentives for the good, as we heard yesterday from Lord Glassman. Politics as creating the space for living together and for human flourishing. And last but not least, we learned from the previous social week that there exists a paradoxical tension between realism and imagination. Realism frees us from becoming blind for the meaning of the fundamental transformations of our society. Forward-looking imagination helps us to see beyond the negative trends how the future emerges. But above all, we need in our conversations the same spirit as years ago was expressed by Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, Die Zeit drängt. Time is pressing. There is no room anymore for freewheeling. Solutions will not fall from heaven, and it makes no sense to wait for Godot. And we should not be blinded by irrational fear. During this conference, we need a conversation in view of action beyond the safe heavens of the comfort zones of the past. Action rooted in the courage to move beyond the established ways of thinking via new life-giving experiments, which Zizek calls acts. Indeed, the future requires vision, but the present radical and reasonable action. If we are not responding to that, the future generations will hold us responsible, and that would be a fundamental sin of omission, as Mr. Donner said yesterday. Thank you.